Okay, we'll get going here. Let me put my mask on. I'm very pro mask, but I'm just tired of wearing them. So I'm trying to not wear it as much as I can get away with. It's not just COVID. Like, I wanted to wear the mask the rest of my life because I got less colds, less flus last couple of years. But I'm just tired. I'm just tired. It hurts my ears. So if I sneak it off in class, don't report me. Okay, who's going to do a presentation today? You sent me yours?
Yeah.
Marcus? Yeah. Okay. Anybody else? Anybody online? Okay, good. I'm glad because we have a lot to get to today. Okay, hold on a second. I thought I had the PowerPoint up and I don't. Okay. Anybody that just came in expecting to do a presentation today? No? Okay. All right, well, let's get going. So we're going to try to get through most of this chapter today. I know we're a class behind. I don't want to get too far behind though, because monetary policy, which we start next week, is a big concept, big topic that a lot of people aren't familiar with. So it can be kind of a little bit harder. For fiscal policy, we've been leading up to this for the last few weeks. So hopefully a lot of this is very easy to understand. So I'm going to go kind of fast. The more we can get found today, the more we can get to monetary policy next week. So let's talk about fiscal policy. So fiscal policy is government spending and government taxes. So you can see on this chart here, we have government spending and government taxes of several countries, US. Showing here that we spend more than we tax, right? Same in Japan, Canada, France. Right, and this is a percentage of GDP. So the government spends 35% or so, this is 2016, and taxes 34% of GDP. So of that money, some of that money is government transfers, which we talked about before. So a government transfer is going to be when the government is taking money through taxes and then giving that money to somebody else. So they tax the general population and then transfer some of that money to a specific population. So the big ones are Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. So Social Security is mainly a retirement benefit where everyone that works is taxed. And then when you retire at 65-ish, you get a monthly income. Also, with Social Security, you can, if you're disabled, you can claim Social Security at any age. Medicare is healthcare for older people, 65 and older, paid for by the government. So everyone's taxed. And then at 65, people over 65 receive that value of healthcare. And Medicaid is a state-run program in every state. It's funded by the federal government for healthcare for people in poverty. So Medicare is kind of interesting. Before Medicare, well, a lot of older people didn't have any kind of ability to have health insurance because they're not working, and a lot of our health insurance is through employment and can't afford it. So we just had a whole aging population when they needed the most healthcare and had none. So Medicare is a great program for that. Social Security is another kind of thing where before Social Security, people got old, couldn't work, and just lived on the streets. They just had no income. So it's a great program. Now, what does this mean though for transfers? When you put your money in Social Security, when they take your money out of your paycheck every week or every paycheck, that's not going into an account for you, and it's not being invested for you. It's not like a 401k where it's, you're contributing your whole life, and then you start withdrawing that at retirement. Your money and my money gets taken out of our paycheck and immediately gets transferred to somebody on Social Security. That's why we're not going to run out of Social Security. All this stuff you hear, are going to run out of Social Security. That's not going to happen because that's not how it works. You don't run out of it because it's literally taken from one person and transferred to a different person. So when I retire, it doesn't matter what they did with all my money all this year. What matters is that they're still taxing, you people, because you'll still be working. You'll be giving it to me. Thank you. So it's a transfer. That's not what it is, transfer. Okay. So sources of tax revenue in the United States. So this is where our taxes come from. So corporate profits about 10%, personal income taxes about 37%, Social Security insurance taxes 24%, and other 30%. Right. So the Social Security, remember, taxing, but it's being transferred immediately out. Right. Personal income tax is the majority. This corporate profit, this was in 2016, excuse me, and this has probably changed now because we actually lowered a couple of years ago corporate taxes pretty dramatically. So corporations are paying much less taxes. Then what do we do with it? What does the government do with it? Medicare and Medicaid, the ACA gets about 21%. Other goods and services, what's that other goods and services? That's like buying steak at the FBI. Social Security, 15%. Education, 14%. National defense, 12%. Right. Other government transfers like unemployment, things like that, 11%. And interest payments, 11%. What interest payments? Well, we're going to talk a little bit about government surpluses and government deficits. So when the government is at a deficit, which just looked at in 2016, we 31% of GDP in revenue, but spent 35%. So where did that 4% come from? It came from loans. Government borrowed, and then the government has to pay back. So you pay back, and so 11% of our GDP, of our income, went to just interest payments, not paying it back, just interest payments. 11%. And 12% went to national defense. So what are we talking about? I don't know what it was in this year, but the national budget is probably $14–15 trillion, maybe even 20 trillion. I don't know. 12% of that went to the national defense. So what is that? $750–800 billion. Almost the same as much as interest payment. So we're spending $750–800 billion in interest. So why do we care about government spending? Well, it is one of the elements of GDP in and of itself, government spending, the G. So we care. But also government spending dramatically impacts the CNI, the consumption and the investment spending. So what the government's taxing and spending, not only is its own whole element of GDP, but it also dramatically affects the other two important elements of GDP. So we care a lot about what's happening with government spending. All right, so how is it affected? Well, governments are affected by taxes and transfers, and business investments affected by taxes and regulations. So if taxes go up, we have less money in our pocket to spend. If taxes go down, we have more money to spend. So the government can shift the AD curve through controlling how it taxes and spend. Okay? Not the AS curve, or at least not as directly. It is mostly fiscal policy, mostly affects aggregate demand. So fiscal policy, in summary, is the use of taxes and government transfers and government purchases of goods and services to shift aggregate demand. So then we have, so as a concept, that sums it up. Fiscal policy is what the government decides to spend and decides to tax, and how it impacts GDP through investment and consumption and government spending. Now, there's two ways they can do things. The government can do policy that expands GDP. Okay, so this would be if they purchase more stuff, if they cut taxes, if they increase transfers. This is all adding money to the economy, right? Pretty obviously. If you buy $1 billion more of tanks, then you're spending $1 billion in the economy. If you cut taxes in half, then everyone doubles the amount of money from their taxes. They have less taxes means more money in their pocket to spend. And if we decide to come up with Social Security too, and it applies to everyone, then basic income, right, which was a topic in the last election cycle, where everyone would just get a monthly check, right? That means everyone has more money in their pocket to spend. So expansionary fiscal policy is extra fuel, expands. So what that looks like from last week, from our ADAS model, is that when we're at potential, everything's good, and then something happens and that AD curve shifts to the left, and now we're in a recession, and prices have gone down, but we've contracted GDP, we're in a recessionary down, then fiscal policy would move to bring AD back over. Right? People there on the demand side have more money as a result of expansionary fiscal policy, so they start buying more. On the opposite side, that's contractionary. Decrease aggregate demand. Reduction in government purchases of goods and services, or increase taxes, or reduce government transfers. All these things put the brakes on the economy. That sounds bad. Why would we do that? Well, we learned on Tuesday. We do that because when the economy is doing really good, we're in this inflationary gap, right? Look what happens. Prices go up. So a booming economy, a great economy above potential output has bad effects. It causes inflation. It causes behavioral choices in people where they're trying to, keep up with their neighbors, and there's increased fraud. And there's all these bad things that happen when we are above our potential output. So the government can raise taxes, they can lower its spending, they can lower its transfers, and bring us back in alignment with potential output. Yeah, so I don't like this doing by learning practice question. I often skip these because this is a bad question. Do you think the government is right to begin massive spending programs? Right, because though this begs an answer that is my personal belief as opposed to looking at what the actual data, what the math shows. And the math shows this is how this stuff works. So why do they ask this? Because they want to bring in these critiques. The critiques of fiscal policy. Common ones are government spending always crowds out private spending. Another common critique is government borrowing crowds out private investment spending. And then the third common critique is that government budget deficits reduce private spending. So let's take a look at those one by one. Okay. Government spending always crowds out private spending. So what is crowds out? As a reminder, crowds out is when if the government is doing something, then that means there's less availability for private citizens and private companies to do it. So if we're talking about crowding out private spending, the theory is the more the government spends, that means the less the private sector can spend, which means less income for the private sector, which means, lots of different bad things. But that assumes that we have a zero-sum economy, and we don't. We've been learning from day one in this class that economy equals GDP equals expansion. It's always growing. We want it to grow. Right? It's not zero sum. There's not a limited number of dollars in our economy. That means if the government's spending it, then there's less dollars available for the private sector. Part of that is built into this idea that even if it were a zero sum, which it's not, that zero sum would require us to always be at full employment and always use all the resources effectively and efficiently, which we don't do. So not only is it not zero sum, we have lots of room in our economy most times to grow employment and to use our other resources more effectively and efficiently. This is such a weird, like I've said this before, I just use a publisher books, PowerPoints. I don't create these. It's hard, I don't know, it's just the weirdest like analogy here. You're squeezed out only if the hot tub's full. And I think what it means is if the hot tub's full of people, then you can only get in if somebody gets out. So the government is getting into the hot tub and the private sector has to get out. For the longest time, I thought that meant that the water was full. So if you get in, the water comes out. I don't know, maybe it's weird. Okay. The second critique is kind of partially true. Second critique is government borrowing always crowds out private investment borrowing. And this one's kind of true because in this one, it is closer to that zero sum scenario. Because there really is a limit to the amount of funds that are in the loanable market. There's only so much money that people have in their savings account or in the stock market. There's only so much money available to be borrowed by people looking to borrow. And because that's true, when the government borrows, it's soaking up some of that available funds. And it can soak up so much there really isn't money left over available to be borrowed out, loaned out. Or there is, but people are like, well, I'd rather go on Alaskan vacation. So if I'm going to lend it to somebody without, instead of on my vacation, I'm going to want like 20% interest back. Right. So there is some crowding out effect with investment. But the caveat is it's only really when the economic circumstances are so that, we're in a booming period. When the economy is depressed, when we're in a recession, then there tends to be a lot more loanable funds, and there's more than enough, and there's no crowding out. Right, and then the other part of that is even when things are booming, more people have, if things are booming, I'm gonna have more money and I'm gonna put more in savings. So it's really only partially true under set circumstances. Okay, and then the third critique is this: government budget deficits reduce private spending. The Ricardian equivalent. So 19th century, so even before macroeconomics was even thought of. This is the old way of thinking that got us in trouble, but it can be partially true, but let's think about it for a second. And what it was assuming is that this idea of lifelong spending. So, and the books talk about it before, we didn't really talk a lot about in the lecture, but the idea is that people have this naturally set idea of how much they're going to spend in their lifetime. So if times are tough now, they don't just go by what's going on right now. They think about the future. So if that's true, then if the government's spending a lot, building up a deficit, then it assumes that people will think, well, I might have lots of money now because the economy is doing so great, but then things are going to be bad later, so I better adjust my spending now. So the budget deficit from government spending leads to people being, well, I'm worried about what's going to happen in 10 years, so I better stop spending. How is that's not how people work? Do you guys work like that? the economy is booming and you get a great job because the economy is booming and your paychecks are huge, you know, maybe you put a little in savings, maybe a little extra in savings, but generally it's, I'm going to go buy a nicer car. I'm going to buy a hot tub, whatever. That's how people work. So this assumes a behavioral element that isn't true of people. I mean, it's true somewhat in the short term, but we're not talking the short term. This is the assumption of lifelong earning theory. Okay, so here's the real problem with fiscal policy, not the common critiques. The real problem with fiscal policy is that it takes time. So it takes time to know that we're in a recession. And then if we know we're in a recession, it takes time for politicians to acknowledge that we're in a recession. And then it takes more time for politicians to agree on if we should do so. And then it takes more time for the politicians to actually do so once we all agree, right? And then once they have the spending package in Congress and the president approves of it and it goes out for spending, then it takes time to actually do it. So if the spending is like building a big dam, you don't build a big dam overnight. It takes years of planning and construction. So you could have a situation where the recession's happening now and the expansionary fiscal policy of spending happens in 5 years. But the recession is not going to be still happening in 5 years. In 5 years, we could be naturally into an expansionary period and we're just overheating and causing inflation. The same is true the opposite. You know, the idea that things can be really booming and really good, and it's not apparent how good it is. And it takes some time to understand that before we cut taxes and get political, or excuse me, raise taxes to slow down the expansion. And that takes a lot of political will because no politician wants to raise taxes. So that takes time too. Okay, I think we had this presentation. Somebody did this, yeah, you did. And now, yeah, that's right, it was really good. So I won't go into this too much, other than reminding that this is unemployment rate over the quick rate, right? We're talking about the causes of the recession, causes of the stimuli here. So in 2009, everyone's losing their jobs. And they couldn't get a new one, so we need to stimulate the economy. And in 2017, people were quitting their job. And why do people quit their job? Well, it's not because of recession. It's because they are very optimistic about their ability to get a new job. So things are good. So stimulus. We need to look at the cause of why of what the numbers mean. So the unemployment rate itself didn't tell the whole truth, because we can look at what the cause of the unemployment was. In 2017, we have indicated that the unemployment was caused because of a good economy, people moving jobs, getting better jobs. Okay, the multiplier. So we've introduced it a few times now. So let's get to what the real meat of the multiplier. So remember, the multiplier is that everything's connected. So if somebody like the government spends money, then the people they give that money to, spend that money, will then use that as their income and turn around and spend a portion of that based on the propensity to consume. So if they spend 50% of every dollar they get in and put the other 50% in savings, then of the original government spend, they'll turn around and spend 50% of that. And then the people that got that 50% will spend 50%. It goes around and around until there's a total effect on the economy. So fiscal policy is one of the greatest benefits of the multiplier. So here's an example of the government makes a purchase of goods and services, and our national NPC is 5. So we spend 50% of every dollar we get in as a nation. Then we go through our 1/1 minus MPC, we get a multiplier of 2, and then we can just do the simple math that a $50 billion spend is a $100 billion increase into our GDP, to our economy. So if the government spends $50 billion on new tanks or new staplers or whatever, we have a real wealth increase in this country of 100 billion. Yeah.
I was just curious, what's the time scale on this? Like, how long would it take to go from 50 billion to 100 billion?
Yeah, so that's there's not a definite question, and it has to do with how fast the money is circulating in the economy, which we're actually going to get in the next chapter. I think it's the next chapter.
Okay.
But there's a statistic that we track of how fast the money is circulating through the economy.
Okay.
So how fast that each dollar turns over is going to determine that. But we're talking in the short run. This is not years.
Okay.
I should make the exception, though, that when we're talking $50 million spending, that takes time. So if you're going to build the Hoover Dam again, you don't build it overnight. It might take 5 years. So how fast that money is being spent times how fast money circulates is going to give us that answer. But we're generally talking this is a short-term effect. So, and again, let's remind ourselves, real GDP, this is actual wealth of the country. This is not made up, mythic, this is not like magical money. This is government spends 50 billion and our country becomes $100 billion wealthier in real terms. Okay, but that's just spending goods and services. What about these other things? What about government transfers? So we implement basic income, and everyone gets a check every month for $1,000. Right? That's a transfer from not spending. There's no middle purchase. The government's not buying a tank or a stapler. It's just skipping that purchase part and giving it to that next round, that person. So because of that, it has a different impact on the multiplier. And what that impact is that first 100 billion never, or first, on this example, 50 billion of that spend doesn't count. That first step, that spend, doesn't ever increase the economy. Only those next rounds do. Right? So that 50 billion increase in government transfers, we apply our multiplier, right? And we get it's less. We skip that first step. So in the end, the 50 billion increase in transfers is 50 billion increase in GDP versus on the goods and services purchase, it's 100 billion. So it's a different formula. So what we learned before is the spend, the increase in spending times 1/1 minus MPC. Now it's the increase in transfers times MPC times 1/1 minus MPC. All right, so on the exam, hopefully you remember the formula, but more importantly, the concept is you're missing the spend. You're missing that first step. So it's the same effect minus that first step never happened, that first initial spend. Okay, so what about taxes? Taxes are a unique thing. There's kind of two elements here for taxes. So the first element is what happens if I reduce taxes? Well, in tax law, in accounting, if taxes are, if you lower taxes, it's actually called in the IRS and called in Congress a tax expenditure. So lowering taxes, the government actually sees as they're making a spend. So if you think of it like that, the multiplier makes sense. So if you lower taxes and the net effect is that everyone paid the net effect is a $50 billion increase in people's pockets to spend, then the multiplier will affect on that 50 billion. Much like this, the transfer. But here's the problem with the tax. Here's why it gets way more complicated. Because taxes are not lump sum. We don't all just pay 10 grand in taxes every year. We pay taxes based on what our incomes are. So it's fluctuating. We all have different incomes. And we also pay taxes differently based on our income level. So it's progressive. So I make more, I pay more as a percentage of my income because I make more income than somebody else. So because of that, the tax revenue will depend on the real level of GDP. Okay, so let's think about that for a second. If I make more money, I pay more in taxes. And if I make less money, I pay less in taxes. And as a whole, if everyone's doing well, they pay more in taxes. And things aren't doing well, as a whole, we all pay less in taxes. So if things are going well and we're paying more in taxes, then that means we have less money to buy things. Yeah.
And if you make a lot of money, then you could pay less taxes.
Well, that's true. That's true. The effective tax rate. Yeah, well, actually, it depends on the character of the money, right? So, so on income tax, the more you pay, the more you make. But if you're rich and you're getting capital gains tax and not paying much income, that's what like Bill Gates and people do. That tax rate's much lower. So it pays to be rich and to have a good economy. Yeah, so if I make so as a whole, we're all making more. That means we're all paying more taxes as a whole. And what happens when we pay more taxes? We have less money to spend. So it's kind of like the opposite effect. So things are going great. So we have this money taxes taken out, a chunk of that greatness. And what that's called is an automatic stabilizer. So built into tax policy, the effect of tax policy is not the purpose of tax policy, but the effect of tax policy is it stabilizes the economy, the business cycle. So how's it stabilize? Well, just like I said, things are going great. We're going in an inflationary gap. We're above potential output. Everybody's getting more money and everything's great. And because everybody has more wealth and more income and the taxes are more, then that means that we get to spend less because the taxes are higher. And when we get to spend less, that has a negative effect on the economy. And the same goes the other way. We're going into a recession, things are bad. When things are bad, we pay less taxes because we have less income. And what happens when we pay less taxes? That means of what we did make, we have more to spend. So it starts accelerating. So the worst the recession gets, because of how taxes work, we have an accelerating effect. And the better things get, because of how taxes work, we have a decelerating effect. So it's an automatic stabilizer. It takes the extremes out of the business cycle. Right, so that's automatic, because that's just happening by the way our tax system works. And what we've been talking about up until now is discretionary. When Congress comes in and says, we're going to spend $1 trillion because we went into a recession. That's just at the discretion of our politicians, spending money to stimulate or to contract the economy. I think we had a presentation already on austerity. So I won't go into this too much, but again, austerity is when when we're in a recession and we say, well, we should tighten our purse strings a little bit. Right? Money's tight, so let's spend less, which is the opposite of what we should do, but that's austerity. So austerity has that a multiplier effect too, but it's the negative effect when we need a positive effect. Okay, let's talk about government, balanced budgets. So we learned in the first slide that in 2016, we as a percentage of GDP, we spent in this country about 4% more than we earned. So where does that money come from? We borrowed. That sounds bad, right? Borrowing money, deficits are bad. Maybe surpluses are good, maybe they're bad. Well, let's talk about what they are. So the savings rate of the government equals our taxes minus our government spend minus our transfers. So if that rate is positive, we have a surplus, and if it's negative, we have a deficit. Right? It's not a profit. Right? If we tax more than we spent, it's not a business, it's not profit. Okay? The goal is not the profit, it's a surplus. So other things being equal, discretionary, expansionary, fiscal policies reduce the budget balance for that year. Expansionary, again, spending money or taxing less. That will reduce the balanced budget, put us negative in a deficit typically, to reduce the surplus. And contractionary fiscal policy increases the balanced budget. So we spend less, we tax more, and that means we have more money left over at the end of the year. So the budget deficit is very closely tied to business cycle. Right, so we have these periods of recession, and we see that we have a higher deficit. And so we're in the red as a country. You know, the 2%, 4%, 6% deficit. And we can see that the deficit tails recessions. It goes up at the end of recessions, presumably because we're spending money and lowering taxes to get us out of the recession. And it goes, so this down here would be a surplus. So look at it. We get surpluses. We got a surplus here after a long period of expansionary policies. Excuse me, contractionary policies as a result of a naturally expansive economy. So they're tied. Here we can look at another one of those ties, unemployment rate versus budget deficit. Again, we'd expect unemployment rate to go up during a recession. We'd also expect higher fiscal spending during recession. So they're correlated with a lag in the budget deficit. Okay, so deficit is correlated with the business cycle. And we know that we can use a deficit that comes from expansionary fiscal policy to help us overcome the tendency in the business cycle to get out of a recession. So we can't look at the business cycle as a bad or good thing causing the deficit. We have to somehow weed out that noise of the business cycle to understand what the big picture is. And what the big picture is are we spending in line with what we're taxing over the long run? Because over the long run, it's bad to spend more than we tax. But in the short run, it serves this other purpose of getting us out of recession or getting us contracting a bad, overheated economy. So in the short run, it can be good. In the long run, it's bad. So we look at that by doing this cyclical adjusted balance budget. So the cyclical balance budget is the orange line, and the purplish line is the actual. So what we can see is that our cyclical, taking out the effect of the business cycle over the long run, seems to be pretty good. maybe a little bit on the deficit side. And then we have these periods, the actual budget, where we go into a higher deficit for the intended purpose of getting us out of recession. So when we hear on the news about we're in a huge deficit, that doesn't mean anything, good or bad. Because the deficit has, if it's for a good effect of getting us out of recession, we want that. But we need to look at it as a long term. Okay, I think this was another presentation we had. Okay. So I think we'll end it there. On Tuesday, we'll go over the long-term effects quickly, deficit versus debt, and then we'll start monetary policy. Okay. So let's take a quick break. 3:16, and then we'll do our presentation. Or 3:50, yeah, 3:16. Let's get going again. So before we get to our presentation, I wanted to point out, because there's an important economic concept. It's Kevin, right?
Yeah.
Kevin, your name's Kevin?
Yeah.
Okay, Kevin pointed out something really astute here. Because when we talk about these, we're learning about fiscal policy. And we've learned that cutting taxes, increasing spending has a positive gain. But how you do it affects people differently. So if we cut taxes, and those taxes are affect mostly predominantly richer people, then they win from that gain. Now that money will get spent into the economy potentially, but maybe not, because if you're a millionaire, you get an extra $10,000, you're more likely to put that in savings or something and not go out and spend it. But if you give $10,000 to a student, you're more likely to go out and spend it because they need to buy things. So that has a real world impact on this fiscal policy of, even though we might have 100,000, this huge gain from the multiplier, who gets that gain affects how it really affects the economy. And to give this example, if you're rich, you pay less taxes. So here's the tax bracket for 2022. I hope you guys know how the tax bracket works, but how it works, if I'm rich, say I'm making $1 million a year in income, on that what I pay in taxes is I pay 10% the first 10,000, and then I pay 12% of the next, this bracket. So my total taxes at this point would be $1,000 plus 12% of whatever I make over that, right? You keep adding it up. And then you come down to here, tax bracket 539, right? So my tax liability would be 162,000 of the income up to this point, and then 37% of that income above 539. So if I'm making $1 million, it'd be 37% of 461,000 plus 162,000. So that's a lot of money. This is $250,000, $300,000 total that I'm paying in taxes, federal taxes. If I'm making $1 million, I can afford it. I'm making $1 million. But then you hear people like Elon Musk or Bill Gates, and they're CEO of their corporation, and they're getting a salary, maybe $100,000. So they're going to pay that taxes. $100,000 on that income tax. So wherever they would be, they'd be here. So they pay 15,000 plus 24% of that, whatever remaining. So they're going to pay like 20,000 a year on taxes. Well, how does that make any sense if you're a billionaire? Because the rest of that money they're making is from their stock they own in the company. And that stock they own in the company is taxed at this rate, at 15%. So if Elon's stock he's only paying 20,000 a year on his salary, but his stock appreciated 100 billion over the last year. He doesn't pay any tax on that 100 billion until he sells some of it, and then he only pays 15%. And that 15% is actually the net from how much money he made when he sold stock versus if he had other stock that he sold at a loss, you subtract that. So it's only 15% on the profit from selling that stock. So you and I, at no point, unless we're making under this amount of money, 41,000, anybody that makes over 41,000 pays more in taxes than a wealthy person that's making most of their income through capital gains. So this is why the rich people pay less. It's all about how the characterization of the money you have coming in. It's much better to have that characterization in long-term capital gains. And the other thing about that is, oh, I forgot. It has some brilliant point. Oh, I know what it was. So the Trump tax cuts lowered this for a few years. So lower income wage earners like us had lower taxes for a couple of years, and then it went back up to the before the tax cut. Meanwhile, this went from, I forget what it was, 22% down to 15% permanently. So a few years ago, rich people paid 22%. Now they only pay 15%. So that, you know, and that 7% savings is benefiting our economy through the multiplier, but only when they actually sell, and only when if they use that money and spend it, which they don't. How many yachts can you have? And also they don't ever spend it, right? You know that, you know, billionaires don't spend their money. They don't pay the taxes. They don't have to. Because what you do when your stock is worth $100 billion, lots of banks will loan you money against that collateral of the stock. So you live the life of a billionaire, you have lots of money in cash, and that cash is all loaned to you from the bank, and you don't pay any income taxes on loaned money. So, yeah, I recommend being rich through stocks. Okay, we had one presentation. Who was it? I forget. Marcus, you ready? Come on up. Okay, when you change slides, just click on the slide.
So don't use the arrows?
No, don't use the arrows. It messes up the share on the Zoom.
Well, okay. I'm Marcus, and I'll be presenting the chapter 13, the last economics in action in chapter 13 in the business case. So the economics in action was called reducing implicit liabilities. The summary is implicit liabilities can be brought down by government policies that reduce future spending. Government policies such as the Affordable Care Act help bring down projections of debt held by the public. So in 2010, it was projected that the debt would be 185%. And then when the Affordable Care Act got passed, the 2016 projection lowered it to only 110%. So even though implicit liabilities are an important issue, it doesn't mean that the government should raise taxes or reduce services. And these liabilities can be reduced by providing government services in a smarter and more efficient way. So why is this in the chapter? Well, implicit liabilities are spending promises made by governments that are effectively a debt, despite the fact that they're not including the usual debt statistics. These liabilities arise mainly from transfer programs such as Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and the Affordable Care Act. And the projected rise in healthcare spending is a serious fiscal problem, since more people will be eligible for Medicare and because older people tend to have higher medical costs. I believe that the economic principle in play was principle 12, government policies can change spending, because it's all about fiscal policies. That's basically this whole chapter. So fiscal policies changes the amounts of taxes the government collects, which like goes into social security and Medicare and all that stuff, and how much the government spends to stabilize the economy. So my business case is called Here Comes the Sun. It's about the Solana power plant that is based in Arizona. And the summary is it uses solar energy to heat tanks of molten salt, and then it uses the heat of the salt to generate electricity, which I don't know how that happens, but it works. The amount of solar generated electricity has increased 800% between 2008 and 2016. That happened because the 2009 stimulus was a major benefactor for that rise. It put substantial sums into the promotion of green energy. There were many protests for the construction of this power plant because it was being built by a non-American firm named Ambigoa. Even though Ambigoa had the necessary technology and created jobs for the project in the United States, people protested over the federal loans that Ambigoa received, which was $1.45 billion. So why is this in the chapter? It demonstrates how fiscal policies such as the 2009 stimulus can be used to spend government money on important projects such as building a renewable energy plant. So some outside research I did about the Solana power plant is it's one of the largest concentrating power plants in the world. It provides clean energy to 70,000 households and reduces carbon emissions up to 475,000 tons each year. And it generated more than 2,000 jobs during its construction and 85 jobs in its operation. So the questions for thought at the end of the business case were, how did the political reaction to government funding for the Solana project differ from the reaction to more conventional government spending projects such as roads and schools? And what does the case tell us about how to assess the value of a fiscal stimulus project? I don't think I answered the second question, but the first question I answered that people didn't like the fact that the government was loaning money to a non-American firm. I don't know why. But since roads and schools are more local, they would applaud the government for spending towards that. Like, that's my opinion. And the second question was in the chapter, we talked about the problems of lags in discretionary fiscal policy. What does the Solana case tell us about the issue? Well, one of the lags was it takes time to spend money. And the long-term financial viability of solar power projects like this depend on whether government subsidies and other policies favoring renewable energy will continue. That was explained in the business case by them. The third question is the depth of recession a good or a bad time to undertake an energy project? Why not? I think this was more of an opinion-based question, but I said it was good because it increases government spending and provides more jobs for the unemployed. And that's it.
Great. Hold on a second. Since you did some outside research, I'm curious, in your outside research, did you find out who was objecting? Did it to the Solana?
I think it's just like regular Arizonian people.
Yeah, okay. Okay, go ahead and sit down. Thank you. Great. I appreciate the outside research. I know you guys are probably too young to remember the Solana. It was a big thing because it was a political thing. It was the critics were looking for any reason to hate it because it was green energy, which at the time a lot of proponents or opponents to green energy, it's a waste of money, don't use government funds on it. So it became a Republican Democrat argument, and it was unfortunately a victim of that issue of political disagreements opposed to any real impact. And part of that was brought out by this outside research that he did, is that the project was a foreign company, but it was local. So it was built by local construction crews and run by local employees. So that money went to our economy. The other thing I was going to mention, if anybody is interested, how molten salt makes electricity is almost all power generation from coal to nuclear plants to Solana to molten salt plants. They just make steam. That's all they do. All these power plants just heat water to make steam, right? Because steam volume expands. You take that expansion and put it through a turbine that makes electricity. So you think of a nuclear power plant, all nuclear power plants, a fancy way to heat water. This concentrates the light into a single point, heats up the salt, and melts it. And then that melted salt, and most of these plants then goes and heats up water. So why salt? Why not just boil the water there, is that salt will retain the heat all night, allowing you to keep working after the sun goes down and cycling that heat back into the water. So interesting stuff. Okay, great. All right. Anybody else want to do a presentation today? No? I swear we had more scheduled. Okay, great. Let's do our fiscal.